From Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, California, Libros Schmibros Lending Library presents the Latinidad Beyond Borders podcast. Latinidad encompasses the diverse experiences of people who live in Latin America, as well as people of Latin American descent who live in the United States. This podcast explores culture, society, and politics across the Americas through the lens of Latinidad. Welcome to another episode of Latinidad Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Alberto Sahagún. Today's topic is Brazilian politics. My guest is Rafael Ioris, and you can tell me if I pronounced that correctly.
That's right.
He's professor of Latin American history and politics at the University of Denver. In 2014, he published a book called Transforming Brazil, A History of National Development in the Post-War Era. He's also published several books in Portuguese. If you understand Portuguese, he's a regular commentator at CNN Brazil. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
So Brazil's been in the headlines recently. Ex-President Jair Bolsonaro on September 11th was sentenced to 27 years in prison for his involvement in an attempted military coup against the government of the newly elected President Lula da Silva. But let's go back to 2018 when Bolsonaro was first elected president. Bolsonaro was an ex-military officer. He was a longtime member of the National Congress, had long expressed far-right views. So how did he win election in 2018?
Sure. What was happening in Brazil in that decade? Started a little bit actually around 2013, leading into 18. And so just very, very briefly, before the previous decade, which is the early 2000s, is a time when Brazil was seen in the world as really one of the main emerging economies, and also in terms of like reduction of poverty and actually the consolidation of its own democratic institutions. This was the time when Lula was president from 2003 to 2011. It was like a very positive, very optimistic decade in Brazil. A lot of that started unraveling in this following decade. So around 2012, 13 is when the 2008 economic crisis, global economic crisis, really hits Brazil. Commodity prices really go down in many of them, and impacts much of the region of Latin America in that time. And in Brazil, it really almost became like the perfect storm. Already in 2013, to some extent, people on the left actually took the streets to demand sort of rising expectations from the previous decade, the deepening of inclusion, socioeconomic inclusion, better social services. So there was a significant reduction of poverty and access to a lot of services that had been really only accessible to the middle classes. Again, remember, Brazil is one of the most unequal societies in the world, still is, has been always been one of the top 10 most unequal economies in Brazil, in the world. It's a large economy. It's the largest economy in Latin America, but also one of the most unequal ones. So people could continue to demand, rightly so, the access to things. And that kind of destabilized a little bit the government now of Dilma Rousseff, which is followed Lula also in the late Workers' Party. She was the chief of staff of Lula in those first two terms in office. And different reasons is really like the perfect storm. There again, the global economic reasons, also domestic reasons. The groups on the opposition to Lula, conservatives, reactionary groups, including some tied to the military that ruled the country from 64 to 85. So a long 21 years of dictatorial regime. A lot of those people were kind of a little more quiet through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, but always like trying to look for an opportunity to really to go after more progressive sectors and forces in Brazil. And that's exactly what happened in 2014, 2015. People took to the streets, more middle class people and conservatives, supported by big capital, especially in the agribusiness sector, which will prove later to be very important for Bolsonaro to this day. They really took to the streets and demanded that Dilma would be impeached, and they really came up with a excuse to do that. That's why I call it a parliamentarian coup. It was formally an impeachment of her in 2016 because they impeached her on accounting practices that every president prior to her had done, and so it's like, why her, right? Of course, we cannot not take into consideration the fact that she was the first and only woman thus far to serve as president of Brazil. So it's again, many different factors, but they created a situation where established parties, especially progressive parties, center left, like the Workers' Party in Brazil, became like the scapegoat of the time, right? This was also the time of this famous investigation called the car wash operation, led by the federal police and the public ministry, two institutions that Lula had actually buttressed, had strengthened their investigative powers in many different ways, in terms of ways, legal ways, and also funds to be able to carry out their investigations and operations. They really turned, or that investigation was really politically used and utilized by conservative forces in Brazil, going after the Workers' Party, going after Dilma, and going ultimately left to after Lula himself, which was accused of corruption. So she is impeached in 2016. And from that on, there's really like this strange, very neoconservative push, very harsh push, to the right now by her former vice president, but who really came from a very traditional conservative movement and party in Brazil, that really start going this reversion of laborers and workers' rights and social policies starting already in 2016. But the main thing to explain how Bolsonaro, again, a long-term member of the House in Congress in Brazil, the federal House, he reinvented himself as kind of the outsider, very much inspired by one important outsider force in global politics in several years, which is Donald Trump, who's seen as like a really like a twin person in many different ways, political positions, style of politics. We can come back to that. So he emerged as on this anti-establishment, alternative narrative of things. You guys have tried everything, center right, center left parties, and now the one which was seen like the best solution for the country, given all the reduction of poverty in the previous years. Now, the economy in Brazil was also facing a lot of new challenges. Again, the global recession hitting Brazil. So the perfect storming in economic, political, ideological factors. Of course, we cannot discount the fact that forces behind Bolsonaro were, to some extent, working with, loosely or sometimes not so loosely with conservative forces here, that, people attached to President Trump. And especially inspired, right, on the style, the narrative, and the propositions that Trump, sort of represents in the last 10 years in the world. So all parties became really discredited. The political system was very discredited. And going into the election, that car wash investigation came to the its top moment when they they arrested Lula. Former President Lula was arrested. He would serve now over a year and a half, time in prison. Later, this whole trial was going to be thrown out by the Supreme Court, demonstrating that it was politically motivated and was not a fair trial that had led him to prison. But the fact that the Workers' Party was very weak at the time, all other parties were very much in lack of legitimacy and popularity in the country. And Bolsonaro again emerged as this. Why not him, right? The very conservative forces, he coalesced former military people, or people that kind of missed the kind of the so-called effectiveness of dictatorial regime. And again, that's why we need to kind of, the memory of the regime is very important. Brazil never really investigated the crimes of that dictatorial regime. There were moments when that dictatorship, which again has to be called what it was, a dictatorship, a violent authoritarian regime that went after opposition, that committed a lot of human rights violations. But there was a moment in the early 70s that the economy was actually doing okay. So in perspective, a moment now in the mid 2000s, 2017, 18, when the economy is not doing well, the Bolsonaro group really reinvented this narrative. Remember the good old times of dictatorship. Also a situation which is very, very strong in Brazil for a long time. And it's two things related, right? Which means like violence and crimes. And the argument, which is a very recurrent argument on conservative forces in Brazil, is like, we need more paramilitary, or we need stronger hand, mano dura. That's what we need. We need, people to go after and to do whatever needs to be done to take care of, urban violence, criminality, and those. So all of that came together as this perfect, kind of alternative. Other groups that supported Bolsonaro were like evangelical groups who have become a very important political force in Brazil in the last 2 decades. Also very aligned and inspired in the narratives and techniques to the Christian right from the United States. And then the last group would be exactly this: big capital, especially the agribusiness, right? Very conservative and very, very successful business groups in Brazil with the export of, primary goods, especially soybean, coffee, sugar, beef. Very, very powerful, increasingly powerful in Brazil. Again, Brazil is a long time a primary economy, and these groups are always very powerful, but very powerful now politically as well, not only economically. And they presented Bolsonaro as like that's what they call like the myth, the savior, the guy who's going to actually bring everything together, restore order, restore the family values, restore the conservative agenda, restore the work, put workers back on their place. Let's cut all these excessive rights and sort of benefits that the Workers' Party, administrations had provided. So it was a very anti-everything, very reactionary push. And again, I mean, to be fair, he ran an election. We can always discuss, debate, fake news, the role of the social media, which was very important, proven, demonstrated that it played a role. But the fact is that the majority of Brazilians elected Bolsonaro, over 60% of the votes, against the Workers' Party candidate, who's now the Minister of Finance of Lula, and elected him. And so majority of people were really like trying something else, and was very, very popular at that time. Very vocally expressed, anti-Workers' Party, anti-PT, anti-Lula. That's kind of really what the kind of again the moment, the timing, the mood of the time. So he is elected. He serves now. He will serve then for 4 years, and then a lot of things will happen since.
Right. So he's elected with a lot of expectations of change, but well, COVID is one of the things that happens, of course, and the problems that Brazil is dealing with are not easily solved. So Bolsonaro would maintain a lot of popular support, but there are those who, in the next election, 2022, will then vote for Lula da Silva, who's able to come back after his convictions are reversed, or he's allowed to run again. So explain, the factors that led to his defeat.
Sure. So again, it's interesting to always, when I talk or give interviews, about Brazil, not to think about the US. That's why I already made some connections, because there are many similarities, including the fact that the society has been very politically, ideologically, culturally, in terms of more progressive, more conservative values, very deeply, very sharply in the last decade, 2 decades, echoing a little bit the situation here in the United States. So that polarization, that division, that divide, it continues. It's still very much there. But the fact is, Bolsonaro will serve again from 2019 to January 2023. He will really bring a lot of former generals, retired generals, or active generals sometimes, and a lot of he will militarize civilian rule in Brazil, which is really one of the added, tragedies of this whole thing. The country had to fight so hard to end dictatorial regime, militarized regime, and now all these military, top officers from the military armed forces are back in power now. He will again favor big business, the agribusiness for sure, evangelical groups, and all his main supporters, and the military, the armed forces, and really will make a lot of gestures about I need more power. I cannot rule this country just, according to, 3 different branches of power, in the democratic life, which again, the country fought so hard to reestablish throughout the 80s. And he would go to the point to rally his supporters on key like civic dates in Brazil, like Independence Day in Brazil, where he would make speeches about we need to close off Congress, close it down. We need to go after the Supreme Court, which stops me from when I want to do my things that allegedly is what the country needs. Again, a lot of people like that idea and would go to those rallies. And again, the political debate continues to be very polarized. But I mean, if you look at the numbers, how many votes he got when he was elected, and then now running for re-election in October 2022, the fact that he lost, but he lost Lula, again, allowed to run, and he, again, will be the match, Lula and Bolsonaro. The final one, that one was not allowed to take place in 2018. Lula only won October 2022 election by 3 million votes. So it's still very close. And so, which means the country's, there's still a lot of support in Bolsonaro. I think a little less now because of, again, the conviction now, and much of the erosion of his image and the popularity of his movement. But at that time, 2022, it was running for re-election. He used a lot of public money to buy votes, in a way, to say blunt. Again, fake news played an important role, but Lula managed to come back. Lula, again, in a very broad national front coalition. The government of Lula now is much more to the center than his previous ones. It's hard even to call it left. I would say at most center left is a kind of really national front coalition with a lot of even more centrist parties rallying behind him. And again, the decisive votes. Beyond Lula's traditional base, or among the kind of the more poor, especially in some key poorer regions of the country, like the north, northeast, the decisive vote would be the middle class vote, which had gone for Bolsonaro in 2018 and now went for Lula, at least to the extent that allowed him to win. And yes, the main reason it's I mean, one of those things is impossible to finally have the ultimate number evidence, but it seems to be very, very. I mean, what's the intervening variable? It was COVID. So the fact that it's similar to Trump, even worse than Trump, he denied COVID. He said it was a small flu, that everything was okay. He sabotaged the purchase of vaccines in the beginning of the COVID from China by some governors who wanted to do, because the federal government said, we're not going to deal with vaccine. We're not going to. I mean, there's no vaccines. And we're not going to try to create one or to find a way to buy. And so a lot of only after the United States in absolute numbers, Brazil is the highest numbers of people who die because of COVID, close to 800,000 people. And so that really provided a shock of course, to the country as a whole, but especially among the middle classes, who, again, were very, in general, co-opted by the agenda of Bolsonaro before, but now they said maybe they lost a relative or somebody, or just kind of saw the insanity of the way the COVID was mishandled. So now they rally against to bring not necessarily to bring Lula back, but to remove Bolsonaro from power, right? So then Lula won that election, and then the transition seemed to well. Then he said he refused to accept, similar to what happened elsewhere, the results of the election, and would say, the Lula never won. We're not going to allow him to take office. And that narrative really became popular among his supporters, who would rally and camp on the streets in front of barracks, military, bases, to ask them to do something, intervene again. It's a country where the armed forces have intervened many, many times in history. So people just wanted to be done again. Gladly, it did not happen that way, but that was a big support for that. There was a lot of tension. It was a very stressful transition of power, from late 22 into 23. Presidents in Brazil take office January 1st, of the following year after the presidential election. So Lula, in a way, managed. I mean, he took power. He was in power. He was the president of Brazil now. But then there's this attempted, to remove him from power, which happens in January 8th of 2023.
Right. And Bolsonaro was in Florida at the time, right?
Yes.
When on January 8th, 2023, this mob attacks the Capitol, government buildings in the Capitol. And then subsequent investigations found that there were those in the military involved in a coup, or trying to organize a coup attempt that would include assassinating President Lula. Bolsonaro has claimed that he wasn't involved in these things. So what is the evidence of Bolsonaro's role in all these events, these failed attempts to remove Lula?
Sure. So again, in the day, January 8, 2023, the key, the generals that were in office, like the candidate for vice president, who was a former chief of staff, interestingly, of Bolsonaro, the former vice president, another general, and two other generals, an admiral, the people like big shots in government, they were not among the people invading the National Congress building, the presidential palace, and the Supreme Court building. In Brasilia, all those three branches of power are in the same big square. It's called the Square of the Three Powers. That's what it's called. So they invaded and destroyed and looted all those buildings. Eventually, by the end of the day, the police of the federal district in the city of Brasilia is a city like a DC, like a federal district police. They finally decided to act and stop the looting, and they did something and started arresting people. So a lot of people were arrested. Over 1,200 people will be arrested. And since then, many of them have been tried. Many of them, I think about 600, are serving sentences now. There hasn't been any forgiveness or amnesty to them, but not everybody serving like a prison time. But they all been, or most of them have been tried, appealing, of course, according to the law and everything. And one of the main justices of the Supreme Court going after them and leading these investigations is this guy called Alexandre de Moraes, who before already was seen as like a force stopping Bolsonaro's wishes and wills, and so he also became like one of the key figures that Bolsonarismo is against. So in the plan of this invasion of the capital and the presidential palace and the Supreme Court, later will be figured out, right? The plan was to kill Lula and the vice president, and to also kill Alexandre de Moraes. So people have been tried and investigated and tried and sentenced and everything else. But then there was this huge discussion. Well, but who's behind this whole thing, right? People just didn't show up there and did things. And again, Bolsonaro was sending messages from Orlando and in Florida and some other generals too, and people were demanding them to do. And of course, there's people sending messages on the background, but none of them was at the forefront, leading from October into January 22 to 23. But investigations easily they could see how the big shots were behind this, right? And Alexandre de Moraes led this huge investigation over 2.5 years. That became the case against Bolsonaro and these 7 other people. 3 generals, 1 admiral, and 1 lieutenant colonel of the army, and two main important members of the Bolsonaro administration. And they were denounced indicted at the Supreme Court in April in this trial as the planners of the coup, right? And this thing became now known, proven to be an attempted coup. And it's an attempted coup against democracy. That's what the charge is, really: attempted coup against rule of law and democracy, the state of democratic life in Brazil. That's really the name of the crime. And they add 2 different sentences, and then conspiracy and many other those things. They found documents that were very amateur in a way they planned this whole thing. They easily start finding in different computers and sometimes even printed copies on people's houses what they call the plan for the coup. That's the name of the document, the name of the file on people's computers. And they easily could trace and then eventually, tie everything. Of course, a lot of people that support Bolsonaro still say, no, he wasn't involved. It's just these crazy people. And Bolsonaro's main party is the largest, Brazil has a lot of parties, too many parties, over 28 parties in Congress. But the largest one, single largest one, is still one that is the party of Bolsonaro. It's thing very powerful. And beyond that one single party, many other parties are, act together in Congress and in society. So that's why it's Bolsonarismo, right? This bigger movement than Bolsonaro himself. And they have been talking in the media. Media, again, is also very conservative in Brazil. Not surprising. And they've been saying, well, we need to give an amnesty to the poor people, that were caught in the middle of this whole thing, ladies, that were just there in the square when they were arrested. I mean, trying to make this really, really like stupid that narrative of no one knew what he was doing, that kind of thing. And we need to amnesty them. And of course, we also need to amnesty the Bolsonaro and the generals, because it's hard to prove that they were actually inciting people to act violently and all those kind of things. That's kind of their defense, basically, right? But from a general sense in society, in the media, in Congress, but also the defense when the Supreme Court now was doing the trial over the last month, actually this month. So again, indictment and then trials and sessions and everything from July into August and September. And then, a couple weeks ago, there was a final, sentence that Bolsonaro and the generals and the other people behind, 7 other people, 8 people in total, were sentenced now to different sentences. Bolsonaro is the longest one. 27 years and a few months, and then 24, 23, 20, it goes down a little bit, but very heavy sentences against all these people. Of course, some are already in prison because they're already serving time or kind of preventive, what's called preventive arrest, because they could flee, those different reasons. Bolsonaro is in house arrest in Brasilia. But none of them started serving the sentence yet, because there's procedures and everything else, and they can appeal. It's hard that they would be overturned because the Supreme Court is the one decided. So now the main thing shifts back to Congress, especially in the House of Representatives. There's this huge movement to pass a law to amnesty everybody, the 1,600 people, but also the Bolsonaro and the generals. It's hard to see it passing because people took to the streets against this movement already. They try to pass something similar to that, like to protect Congress, as the Congress people. They tried to create this law recently because the Supreme Court could go after some other people in Congress tied to the Bolsonarismo, involved in other things, in addition to kind of top brass of this whole process. And people also took to the streets against that. So the mood, again, it's very divided, but there seems to be a little more of a vibe going in favor, people more motivated to take to the streets to defend this rule of law and the sentences, and the fact that people who are sentenced should actually serve, right? And once everything was decided by the judicial system, of course, granted, you were allowed to defend yourself. If that's your sentence, then that's your sentence. That's what needs to happen. Right? That's the rule of law. So people are a little more on that mood now, taking to the streets and so forth. But there's still conversations, and it's very stressful because, again, they have a lot of votes in the House, and they could try to pass something. They're now pushing also, if not to a full amnesty, but to pass laws that would change the sentence times for different crimes. Of course, the whole point also that legal scholars are debating is that even if they pass a law like that, how would it be retroactive? How could it be applied to things already sentenced, right? So there's a whole legal debate going on in that sense too. But what I want to highlight is that it's not just a legal issue; it's a political issue, right? So there's this whole political process and debates going on. So. I mean, in a whole, if I may, I think we're running out of time to say that this is also it's actually very good news for rule of law and for the state and life of democracy in Brazil in the big picture. But of course, like never has been the case, nothing is smooth or easy or linear, right? There's a big push against, and it's always a little tense, and you have to keep monitoring and keep mobilized, to make sure things actually go the way they're supposed to go. But that's the situation. So again, in the big scheme, it's a good thing, not only because Bolsonaro, again, it's a former military guy, but he never really had a long military career. He's basically, congressperson. But the fact that 4 top military leaders, 3 generals and 1 admiral of the Navy, for the first time in the country's history, a country where the armed forces have acted too often illegally, right, intervene in politics, that they have been sentenced to prison. Some are in prison already, again, preventive prison, because of attempted against democracy, right? That's or acting against democratic life and rule of law in the country. That's a major, symbolic, historically decision and event, which needs to be celebrated and proves, the fact that in Brazil, the country managed to do something that I think, it's what needs to be done in these cases. So.
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about Donald Trump. That's come up, and of course, Bolsonaro and Trump are compared, and Trump has made clear his support of Bolsonaro. But let's compare the series of events, right? January 6th in the US was before January 8th in Brazil, and but things have unfolded differently. Trump was investigated, indicted, but didn't go to trial. Supreme Court said he could run again, and he becomes president again, and he amnesties all the people who were involved in January 6th. So what does that tell us about U.S. politics and Brazilian politics? The similarities, differences, in your view?
Sure. Again, I'm not speaking as a legal scholar, and granted, ultimately, different countries have different legal systems and trajectories, so it's not a perfect comparison. But from a political and historical, perspective, which is the only one I can provide, is I would say, as I briefly mentioned before, I think Brazil did what needs to be done in this situation, right? Recently, one of the authors of the book "Why Democracies Die," Steve Levitsky, professor at Harvard, came out in Brazil, but also before he had published something similar in the New York Times, saying, "Look, today, summer 2025, the state of democracy in Brazil seems to be a little more healthy than the one in the United States." Right. And he was referring to the outcomes of the fact that, crimes against democratic life, democracies, again, it's a fragile thing in which we all take for granted, but actually needs to be protected and nurtured and strengthened, right? The United States, what had to be done because there was an attempt against rule of law and democratic institutions is to investigate to the full extent and to go to the culmination on what the crimes indicate, right? Which so people responsible if there's a crime is that they need to be tried. In the United States, there was a suspension of that trial, right? Again, I think one of the things that in this specific instance helped Brazil. Well, I mean, many different things, I guess. The strength of Trumpism compared to, or the MAGA movement compared to Bolsonaro, I think was always a little larger. Again, the fact that it's a bipartisan system is very binary, right? Brazil, again, Lula could come back because he could move a little bit to the center because it's not as black and white in terms of the political forces in the country. So there are many different reasons, but one is also the fact that the laws in Brazil are very, it's a Roman law. So it's very clear what needs to be done when something happened, right? The challenge is to prove the crime, right? But if you can actually demonstrate, which is exactly what this justice did, Alexandre de Moraes went to the full extent of really, laying out, the plan for the coup and everything else. It's very clear what needs to happen. While in the United States, I think what this country has been seeing, not just now, but in the last decade or so, is a lot of this idea, well, it never happened before. We don't know what to do, right? What's the precedent? What needs to be done in a case like this? And it's a lot of this ongoing question, or lack of clarity on what needs to be done. I don't think that's the only reason, but I think it kind of adds to complexities of how things like this need to be handled. I think the fact that I guess the Supreme Court here is much more in its current composition, much more conservative, much more aligned to the ideas tied, ideologically close to MAGA or to positions allied to MAGA, clearly cannot be discounted, played a role. So all these different things, but the bottom line is again, it's interesting. It's one of those, again, looking in a show here talking about Latinidad, which means the north and south connections in the hemisphere and so forth and so on. Of course, there's a long history for better or worse, and it's a little bit of both. The United States seeing itself as the model, always ahead, always providing what needs to be done in Latin America in terms of, we are more democratic, we are more stable, we are more mature, and you guys just need to follow our recipes. And look, there's something to be said about that in different elements. Granted, also, no one country should go telling other societies what to do. And I'm not trying to do that here in terms of saying what Brazil needs to tell, say what the United States needs to be done. But I think it's just historically very, to say the least, ironic, the fact that actually you could see, democratic, I guess, stability, right, to the south. Well, we see a lot of erosion of democratic norms and procedures and understandings and even expectations of what's going on in the country here vis-a-vis Brazil. Now, again, Brazil is not a model for any other society. Latin America is a region that has many challenges in many dimensions, politically, economically, socially, racially. So that's not what I'm trying to say here, but it's again highlighting the historical significance of what's going on. I would say both in the South and here as well.
Thank you so much, Rafael. That was very informative. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you.